Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the governance stream of the Vic-Water 2020 conference. Earlier this afternoon, we heard the first session of the governance stream, which was a great introduction to Victoria's new environmental protection laws. The second session of the governance stream you've joined today is corruption risks associated with public sector boards. My name is Chris Dalton, and it's my real pleasure to be the facilitator of this session. I am the Corporate Secretary at Goulburn Murray Water, which means that I'm the member of the executive team responsible for governance, integrity, legal services, and water theft compliance. I am coming to you today very proudly from the township of Elmore in northern Victoria. Elmore gets its potable water supply from our friends at Colaban Water. So let me start this session with a shout out to Colaban for the great standard of service they provide to my community. In fact, I might even toast them with a bit of Colaban water. The view from my window right in front of me here is across to the Campaspe River. The river just looks so idyllic today. It's kind of bathed in sunshine. I can see the river. I can see a long stretch of trees, cattle grazing on the other side in one field, and some canola, which is flowering in another field. So let me also give a shout out to the North Central Catchment Management Authority. The Catchment Management Authority has done wonderful restoration projects over the years along the Campaspe, and it's really enhanced the health of our river. I want to acknowledge the importance of the Campaspe to the Dja Dja Wurrung and the Barappa Barappa Aboriginal communities. I also acknowledge all the lands of Aboriginal communities where our conference delegates are joining us from today, and pay respects to their elders past and present. I'm going to begin now with a little bit of housekeeping. So today we are using Zoom webinar as our online platform. If you've attended one of the earlier sessions, you're probably aware that you're not able to switch on your camera or microphone throughout the session. During the presentation, please use the question and answer button to type in questions and comments. I will be relaying these to David during his presentation. I'll be doing that progressively over the course of the presentation. I'll also be doing that in our 20-minute Q&A session at the very end of the presentation. My apologies in advance if we run out of time to discuss your particular comment or question. To get the best possible connection, please ensure that you close all unnecessary applications running on the computer. The session today will be recorded by Vic-Water, and Vic-Water will be providing a link to that recorded session, which will be available from next Monday. Now to our presentation. Awareness of corruption risks is an important responsibility of directors and senior management. This responsibility is even more important in the current working environment when many of us are working from home. In recognition of this, the Victorian Public Sector Commission recently issued a guide for all public sector employees maintaining integrity when working remotely. And I'd recommend it to you for a read. So I am really looking forward to hearing what David's going to share with us today. I am delighted we've got David Wolf with us here today. David joined IBAC in January 2020 as Deputy Commissioner. He is focused on independent oversight of Victoria's public sector. David, before you begin, can I ask you to please share with us where you're joining us from today and what you can see immediately from where you were sitting?
Thanks very much, Chris. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to everybody for tuning in this afternoon. My view is not anywhere near as delightful as the one Chris just described. I'm in Middle Park in Melbourne. I'm on a fairly major road that runs through the suburb. I've got the number 12 tram that runs out the front. And at the moment, Melbourne's quite a funny place. It almost feels like every day is a very quiet Sunday. No one on the trams, a lot of people walking the streets, and it's got a really odd feel about it. So hopefully that changes and we get back to some sort of operating normality soon. Okay, so as Chris described, I want to cover off a few key points this afternoon. I want to talk about the number one red flag for corruption that we see consistently in the public sector. I want to talk about some of the behaviours that allow that corruption risk to flourish. I want to cover off some of the things that senior management can consider to mitigate those behaviours. And then I want to talk about some of the emerging issues that are coming through in this new operating environment under this current pandemic that we face ourselves in, around how we work and particularly how working from home environments are affecting some of the issues that we're seeing. Before I move on to that, I just want to briefly talk about the IBAC. I joined in January of this year. I was fortunate enough to be in the office for about 8 weeks, and then we moved to a working from home environment. So I've had nearly 6 months from working remotely. That said, the role I do is predisposed to a more remote working environment. And as I said, the technology that we have available makes it easy for me to navigate around the organisation. So just as a snapshot of IBAC, for those that aren't across what we do, our role is we're responsible for identifying and preventing serious corrupt conduct across the entire public sector in Victoria, and responsible for misconduct matters relating to Victoria Police. If I can describe our functions as broadly reactive in response to information and intelligence and issues that are sent to us via complaints, and a proactive role in preventing corrupt conduct or police misconduct through recommendations for improvement following our special reports, our research reports, or identifying emerging risks through our special alerts, and of course our engagement and education function. And as a snapshot, our reactive role, we receive around about 3,000 complaints a year. And each of those complaints can be quite complex with a number of allegations. We complete around 40 to 50 investigations each year. Some take no more than 2 to 3 months. Some take up to 3 years or even longer. We're involved in many complex legal matters, including prosecutions of serious offences before the criminal courts. And emanating from that work is a very important function, which is the production of our special reports, which are tabled in Parliament. And these reports encompass all our work and generally are designed to affect broader change in the public sector. And that might be on policy, process, legislation, and it's all about building a corruption prevention across the entire sector. So to best describe how we operate, and I try and give people a sense about our organisation. If you look at it, it's on a continuum between a standing royal commission that has full expository and reporting powers, and then across to an agile task force type environment where we've got our investigation teams with all their technical functions and skill sets, collating evidence and building cases against individuals. So that's sort of a snapshot about how we operate. So let's get to the key issue. Victorian public sector bodies have identified corruption risks associated with procurement as the most common issue, and that's consistently coming up in all our findings, and importantly, almost all IBAC notifications from or involving your sector relate to conduct around procurement. Our investigations over recent time have focused on serious corrupt conduct related to procurement and contract management. And while these investigations aren't from your sector, the issues and findings are very relevant and transferable. And as you know, procurement and contract management is vulnerable to corrupt activity because it can involve large sums of money, often spent in small parcels in a system of complexity with high levels of decentralisation. Procurement, of course, is an everyday and essential activity in the public sector, and it ranges from purchase of low-value goods and services to major infrastructure projects. And although there are frameworks guiding the way procurement should occur, in practice, procurement is often a mixture of compliance with state policy and also a compliance with an individual agency practice, and also informal arrangements or workarounds, which we often see in the work that we undertake. A recent example, which I think is quite relevant, was what we had as Operation Betka, which was an investigation into the conduct of a former project manager at the Department of Education. We published a report on this investigation in May of this year, which is available on our website. And I think, again, I go back to that point about the work we do in this space is quite transferable across the industry. So if you take the example out of the education and overlay it across your organisation, I think you could see how these same themes could occur. And effectively, we investigate allegations that the Education Department project manager used their position within the IT division of education to source IT contracts from a company that he had set up and owned for this specific purpose. And he was gaining a clear personal benefit through this contractual arrangement. His company provided almost $14 million in contracted staffing resources to the Department of Education and Training over a 12-year period. So we found that the project manager had failed to formally declare and manage any conflicts of interest in relation to this contract. He misused departmental information, influenced the process of procuring contracted staff, and obtained an unfair advantage over other IT contract suppliers. We also found that the project manager's supervisors failed to effectively manage the conflict of interest, which was apparent to them, and failed to apply proper process around the engagement of the contractors. So ultimately, the Department of Education ceased the project management's engagement, and the company was ultimately wound up. And there are some ongoing matters that are yet to come through. But as I said, it was a significant investigation for us and exposed some significant corrupt issues that ultimately had to be addressed. And as I said, we go to the next slide. As we transition to that, it's important to think about the procurement red flags that I've just touched on, and whether they are evident in your organisation.
David, sorry if I could stop you there for a minute and just ask a question. Why do you think this happened within the Department of Education? Were there particular risk factors there, and did anyone speak up within the department? Were there people who said enough is enough and tried to make what was happening known?
Yeah. Yes, Chris, I mean, that's a terrific question, and that leads in beautifully to what I'm about to talk about. Thanks for that. I think everyone ought to be sitting there thinking, how does a story like that, how does a situation like this go on for so long? And it's not so much the why, the story is interesting as to, what occurred, but it's the how. How is the important thing. As a senior leaders, and certainly myself, I always ask that question because I want to know, are those same behaviours or systems, weaknesses in the systems apparent in my organisation? And one of the key things that came out of this investigation and most of our investigations is that behaviours that exist that mask the corrupt conduct, and then there's also the systems that allow those behaviours to continue. In other words, when viewed holistically, corruption is properly seen as not just about individual failure, but as a reflection on an institution's overall integrity, including the systems and the people. So addressing the organisational setting in which corruption occurs is the key to succeeding in the fight against it. And a culture of integrity is fundamental to corruption resistance. And leaders throughout the organisation play an essential role in building this culture. And as part of that, the how, we've looked at, as I said, these behaviours that continually pop up. And we've looked at them at 5 individual levels. And the first level is, of course, the individual or the employee, the person that's actually involved in the conduct. And that's whereby an individual officer conceals or fails to disclose wrongdoing, including their involvement. And we're not necessarily speaking about one-off opportunistic conduct, but more the premeditated and the systemic corrupt behaviour. Secondly, we're talking about colleagues that who work with the employee and witness the behaviour, and where those colleagues who suspect or witness the officer's conduct are reluctant or unwilling to report it for fear of being punished or retribution within the workplace. There's a number of reasons why people are reluctant to report it. The third level that we're interested in is that supervisor level and manages the employee. And it's where a supervisor fails to apply rigour and sufficient standards within their team. They're apathetic or unwilling to fully explore the wrongdoing or to consider the role of other team members in the corrupt conduct. And that fourth level we look at is the investigator level. And it's where internal governance or complaints teams within the organisation have ineffective systems for identifying and reporting corrupt conduct, including not adequately assessing evidence of the corruption, which is a really important part of the process. And they tend to focus on the individual behaviour, in the implicit assumption that removing the rotten apple, so addressing the actual person alone, will fix the problem. And what we found is that if the system is not reviewed as to how those behaviours are allowed to flourish, then quite often they can be replaced by another bad apple. And finally, and importantly, and to this audience, we look at the level of the senior leadership, and we look where senior management is perhaps overly focused on getting the job done at all costs, with insufficient focus on the need for ongoing vigilance against poor standards. And for example, where senior management does not see how the culture of perhaps like cutting corners can ultimately allow corruption to take hold and to flourish. These are common types of masking behaviour across all levels that contribute to corruption. We're talking about inaction, favouritism, collusion, obstruction of justice, and an ineffective internal governance environment. Does that sort of make sense, Chris?
Yeah, David, again, sorry to interrupt. Are there any of those behaviours that you think are more prevalent or you see more often, or are the biggest causes of masking corruption?
Yeah. If I was to, I think they're all a collective. I think they all play a part in allowing corrupt conduct to occur. I mean, obviously, there are the drivers behind individuals to act corruptly are quite different. It may be in their makeup. It may be, as I said, premeditated or predetermined. It may be opportunistic over time. But the biggest issue that we see that allows these behaviours to continue is that people around them do not speak up. It's clear to us that people are aware that there is improper conduct or corrupt conduct occurring, and there's just not that confidence to come forward and say something or know who to say something to expose the conduct and have it addressed. And that I think is the number one thing for us. And I'll talk about in a minute about what senior leaders can do to encourage that to not occur.
Great.
I want to talk about one particular example that had all these elements. And it was in my, prior to joining IBAC, I was the head of the Integrity Agency for local government in Victoria. And we had a particular investigation into a council, which ultimately resulted in the chief executive officer being prosecuted for misusing council funds. The issues went considerably deeper than that, than in individual offending, and it went through it seeped through into the council so far that there were completely ineffective audit mechanisms, which I could see was done by design. The policy framework of the organisation was completely deficient, where there were either not policies in place or they were simply not followed. And this resulted in the organisation, managers hiring family members, managers approving payments to family members, employees having a secondary employment and then contracting that employment back to the council itself, and then improving their own work to be conducted outside of their council employment. The list of problems went on and on and on. And it really did emanate from the fact that the senior leadership at the top were not setting the tone of how to act appropriately. It was astounding in that we found an organisation where laws and policies were seen as optional, and the biggest issue was that staff who saw these behaviours were afraid to speak out, didn't know who to turn to. They were concerned about the retribution, perhaps, and it was a smaller town, so they were concerned that if they lost their job, where they would find other employment. So therefore, the behaviours are allowed to go on for a long, long period of time, and ultimately to the detriment of the community. So as I mentioned, the CEO was prosecuted, and the elected council were ultimately dismissed by the state. And the majority of leadership within the organisation were ultimately exited as well. But the effect this had on the entity, on the council, has taken years to repair, and the reputation of the entity amongst the community has taken years and years, and it's still on the pathway of being repaired. So the long tail effects have been quite significant from the behaviours that were allowed to continue over some time. So if we move to the next slide, what I want to focus on now, we've talked about those negative things, what senior leaders can do to focus on that organisational integrity. There are multiple ways that leaders can break the chain surrounding those poor behaviours I've just spoken of. The list on the screen provides some examples based on different roles within the agencies. And specifically in your capacity as directors and senior leaders and managers, you play a critical role in dealing with and preventing misconduct and corruption. It's important for leaders, obviously, to act in the public interest and lead by example. Modelling behaviours expected of all the staff, and I often think that this is a given, but the number of cases at IBAC that I see and we deal with that involve a senior executive is astounding. It is quite astounding. It's important that leaders understand their responsibilities to support staff and to reporting corruption. And I know this can be challenging for many reasons, including the welfare issues and the impact on the workplace. But again, it goes back to that, creating that culture where speaking up is supported and promoted. It's important also to maintain and promote a fraud and corruption control system that proactively manages fraud and corruption risks. And this includes ensuring policies and systems and practices are regularly reviewed by the agency to identify and implement strengthened controls and to build capacity to prevent misconduct and corruption. It's important to work collectively to build corruption resistance across the organisation by supporting the delivery of ongoing corruption prevention training and openly and regularly talking about the integrity and ethics and contextualising this for staff based on the type of work undertaken. And that's a really important point. The message you might deliver to a particular group might be completely different to a message you deliver to, a remote working unit like a depot or something similar like that. It's important to oversee a culture where staff are held accountable for their actions and for complying with policy and procedure. And again, I go back to that council example around the policy framework, which was completely ineffective from not having policy, unadopted policies, and policies which were in place were just simply not followed. So it's important that the policy framework is in place and sets guidance and the rules about how staff dealing in particularly risk areas conduct themselves. And I'm not talking about policy for policy's sake here, but certainly for the risk areas, making sure the policies are in place.
David, just on that point of holding staff accountable, just a comment and an example from Golden Murray Water. One of the processes we do on an annual basis is that every staff member who's got a financial delegation needs to sign off what we call an attestation every year. It's a series of questions asking them about their knowledge of various things, which includes their knowledge of fraud or misconduct. And we've certainly found that just a helpful way of reiterating a message of employee accountability for integrity. And it's also informed us at times about things we need to look into a bit further.
Yeah, that's really important. I think it is well, what I'm seeing firstly is that progressive agencies are including similar sorts of processes as a regular part of their staff engagement. And they're also looking at where agencies such as ours can complement those staff training engagements to make sure that this integrity message is a constant message and not an unusual message to be spoken about. Okay, and finally for leaders, I think it's important that internal integrity and governance teams and systems are well resourced and supported to carry out their role. We saw in the council example once again that it was almost by design that the governance area and certainly the audit function were deliberately left languishing and then unable to execute their role. So leaders who embrace integrity have a focus on building workplace cultures that welcome the opportunity to learn and improve, and they rigorously examine the risks and contributing factors leading to wrongdoing. And by that I mean by asking the right questions, seeking robust answers, you can create an enduring cultural change. And as IBAC, we want the public sector, which is has corruption risks are identified, they're managed, they're treated, almost with the same importance as modern day approach to health and safety management across Australia. And ultimately, the objective is to create workplaces where public value is delivered and people are attracted to working in your entity by the ethical culture that delivers that public value. We might just move to the next slide, and this sort of links into the speaking up and the avenues to report improper conduct. Earlier this year, 1st of January, the public interest disclosure legislation was implemented. There were some changes to the legislation, and the policy position to the changes was effectively to create more, or lower the threshold of matters that can be reported, so therefore more matters can come through the public interest disclosure regime, which means that more matters can then attract the protections for the person wanting to make the disclosure, with the policy aim of encouraging disclosures and providing protections. There were some other changes around a no wrong door policy. So where a matter is disclosed or reported, it doesn't necessarily matter where it's reported to, the system will find the right place to manage the disclosure. But ultimately, as I said, it was about creating more confidence in the system to allow people to report issues that might concern improper conduct or corrupt conduct. IBAC are the custodians of this system, this piece of legislation and the disclosure framework. And it is an interesting and complex piece of legislation from an internal perspective, but externally our message is to managers, leaders and to staff members of public sector entities that the system has been set up to, as I said, protect confidentiality and also make sure that the right agency will address the concerns that's raised. Is there any questions before I move on, Chris?
Yes, David, a couple of questions. One is, has the changes to the legislation that brought in public interest disclosures, do you think that's made a real difference?
Interesting. I've got to say, I think it's a bit early to tell. Our complaint numbers that attract the Public Interest Disclosure Act have risen by about 30%. So it's increased the number of matters that, as I said, attract the legislation. The overall increase in matters has not been that significant. But noting, of course, there's been some delays in implementation. Many public sector agencies, including local governments that were dealing with bushfires, then moved into the COVID environment. So we're seeing delays in some implementation and awareness of the legislation. And I think the COVID environment is also unusual in terms of the type of complaints and what's coming through. So I've got to say, I think it's a bit early to tell, but I also think that the ones that I have had very close eye on, I think it has worked well in many respects, particularly with the way matters move between the integrity agencies and find the right place to be dealt with.
Thanks for that, David. Two more questions. One is, I've certainly always found the public interest disclosure regime to be a very confusing one, and thought that was probably just me rather than anything more general, but you seem to be saying that it is a bit complex. Do you have advice for anyone who's trying to make sense of that regime? Like if you're a director, if you're a general manager, if you're trying to get your head around this kind of labyrinth regime, like do you have some short words of advice?
Yeah, I mean, the shortest word of advice is there's quite a lot of information on our website that steps through a disclosure, a public interest disclosure coordinator, or even a senior executive or CEO in terms of what the responsibilities and the process. So there's a lot of material there, and it's quite user friendly. We've just completed an engagement session across the entire public sector to seek advice around the implementation of the legislation, the awareness of it, and any issues with it. And the feedback is consistent that it is complex, and that's okay. We've used a lot of that feedback to put together a package where we've got suggestions about how it might be simplified to some degree. But overall, I would say that there is information available. There is a contact point within our organisation to assist. The coordinators across the state from all the public sector entities have quite a good network set up. The information provision amongst the coordinators is useful. And as I said, the scheme itself, it may appear complex, but once you talk it through with people that are in it consistently, I'm sure we can navigate through any issues you might see.
David, that's great. I've then got one more question, and this is a question that's come from our attendees. So fantastic. Please keep those questions and comments coming in. It's actually a question I wouldn't mind having a crack at an answer to, and then I'll hand over to you. The question is about, in the context earlier I mentioned an attestation process we had at Gold Murray Water. And the question is, is there a danger that becomes a substitute for other things in the organisation, more proactive things by managers and supervisors? And certainly from a Gold Murray Water perspective, I can say that that's certainly not the only thing we do in the fraud prevention space. It's just one tool in that toolkit. So for instance, another tool we find very useful is when we get our culture survey responses back each year, we can do that in data mapping over different teams for particular questions around integrity questions, and see if there is, particular issues within particular teams in the organisation. But perhaps the related question I was going to throw to you, David, is how do you make processes around integrity, around making sure that this stuff doesn't happen, just not tick the box exercises and tick and flick exercises that everyone gets used to and then doesn't engage with in a kind of meaningful way?
Yeah, that's a great question. Having been exposed to it as an entity head, I've seen exactly what you talk about. The attestation process that I was subject to was pages and pages and pages. It was really complex and very time consuming. So it did become that, let's just complete the box and let's move on to the next one and to the next one, as opposed to thinking about what the questions were asking, and was the agency actually set up and protected to mitigate the risks that were being identified. Now, I often talk about the balance around governance, that it's so important that you have properly funded and resourced governance areas in the organisation, but not to the detriment of operations. You want that nice tension between governance and operation, where they both feel like they're under-resourced and one impedes the other, but you don't want the pendulum to swing too far that you're stuck in the quicksand of governance, or you've got freewheeling operations. So getting that balance is right, and making sure that when you are dealing with processes or tools that are there to help mitigate the risks, that it is targeted and actually, gets you thinking about the actual matter that you're concentrating on. So I sort of hope that makes sense.
It does. That was great. Thank you, David. Look, one last question before we let you move on. And this is, again, a great question from our attendees this afternoon. Are there any behavioural traits that you would consider a red flag? So if you were giving advice to a director or a general manager, if you're dealing with someone, is there a particular behavioural trait that just straight away should make you sit up and take notice and think, I've really got to think further about this staff member?
Yeah. So some of the consistent themes that we see with risk individuals in organisations are those that have been in positions for quite some time and may have been internally promoted into a particular area with expertise and really control that expertise. We often see that then that person might hand select or hand pick who is then working in that team, and there is rarely new people coming in, cycling out of there, and there's also a real reluctance to engage with other areas of the business and also engage with professional development outside of the organisation. So it becomes a silo within the organisation. Often it has a technical expertise attached to it, and it's siloed from the rest of the organisation. And then you've got the personality traits of individuals that are might be quite overpowering in terms of their personality, quite loud. They really do deter people from challenging them from any issue about their work. They will control information movement in and out. Often, they don't take leave, things like that. They're always present, so other people don't get insight as to their own little silo and how it's operating. There's consistent types of behaviours like that pop up in risk areas. But that said, it doesn't take away from the fact that if not properly managed, those masking behaviours I talked about before can occur anywhere across the organisation.
Do you often see the kind of charismatic behaviour where you have the leader who just this strong, overpowering personality and, is that sometimes something that you're seeing at the root cause of some of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to the council example, exactly that. If you go back to some of the IBAC examples of recent times, the major education department investigation we did a number of years ago, the Ultranet example, the person in charge of that, same sort of thing. So yes, absolutely, we see that that's prevalent in a number of matters that we looked at.
Well, David, I've got good news for you. I'm low risk on that factor because no one has ever described me as charismatic. I'll now let you keep moving with your slides.
Yes, thanks, Chris. I think the bookshelf behind might be a fair indicator. Okay, so what I want to move on to now is the COVID-19 environment we find ourselves in. This obviously presents some new challenges and might even amplify some of the existing challenges that we face in terms of corruption risks. Emergency situations, we've had this the season of bushfires, and now we move into the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're compounding emergency after emergency. And in response to this, we produced some material recently which had information around what the key corruption risks are in these times, and some red flags, and suggested some prevention measures that might help minimise the risk. The information sheets are available on our website, and they're a very good read. One of the most prominent issues in crisis response during these times is the need to allocate significant public funds in a time-critical period. And the key risks typically stem from the transfer of funds from public sector to the private sector. And that's for the delivery of services and other support. So the crisis-related pressure on the public sector employee often falls into three categories related to procurement activity, financial management, and the overall governance and transparency of processes. Each of these has their own warning signs, which you can see on the screen, of potential corrupt conduct. And these are useful prompts for staff and also very useful areas to consider internal sample audits to ensure that your processes aren't being corrupted. In addition to the procurement risks and the risks that are on the screen, I think one of the other issues is this rapid change to working from home, which has been phenomenal. It's gone from almost a thing that was not the norm to overnight. Whole organisations are working from home, as I said, for months and months on end. And if you look at some of the risks that might pose, we're talking about where even inadvertent discussion or exposing of information might occur. Mistakes around emails have gone and been sent, cyber threats, phishing emails, people using malicious websites. It creates a whole different range of issues that I think we need to be conscious of. And also, if you just flick to the next slide, the emergency and crisis situations like the COVID-19 also cause personal issues to staff members as well. And that might be financial hardships or even perceptions of isolation, which have potential to increase the employees' risks and vulnerability to corrupt actions and to fraud. So you've got a number of issues there around the transaction of the business. And then you've also got the issues that relate to your actual individual employees, which are all issues that, as I said, are amplified by the crisis we're operating in. It's important to ensure that they're clear and transparent policies and procedures around decision making. However, in these times of emergency or crisis situations, government agencies face increasing pressure to deliver services with less opportunity for face-to-face interaction. In this environment, public sector employees may come under pressure to take shortcuts to accelerate the delivery, such as bypassing proper process and reducing or stopping routine consultations with stakeholders and experts. And this can create risks including nepotism, cronyism, failure to document decision-making, lack of transparency, and overall poor decisions being made. And when I talked about the behaviours for organisational integrity, those points are equally as applicable and in some respects even more important at this time. And for example, we've seen and we've heard that agency integrity related education and training programs may have been postponed or cancelled due to the increased service delivery demands or logistical issues associated with remote working. And our view is that this one piece alone is even more so important at this time. And training is an essential part of remaining connected with your employee base, but also reaffirming the standards, processes and policies that encourage your staff to come forward when something is not right. And I'm sure there's a whole range of other issues that that are affecting staff in their working from home arrangement. So they're the key things. As I said, there's information on our website that we've recently published, and I encourage you to have a look at that. That will give you some more idea about the key points I've just spoken about, and certainly some of the things you might consider as senior leaders around, if you're not already doing, to mitigate those risks. And just lastly, just the next slide, I just want to touch on, to finish up with, the corruption risks around public sector boards. I think there may be some board members participating today, but if not, that's okay. I think it's important to acknowledge the leadership role that the boards play in how our organisations operate. And IBAC recently conducted some research into corruption risks associated with the boards. And as part of the work, we consulted with government departments and a variation of boards across the entire public sector. And the research identified key corruption risks associated with boards, and I'll run through those. But I think what you'll see is, and what you hear is, they're not too dissimilar to what you might find in the organisation. We found that there was issues with boards not properly identifying or declaring conflicts of interest. We found vulnerabilities to theft and misappropriation of funds. We found a susceptibility to bribery and inducements from businesses in return for lucrative contracts. And we found some procurement anomalies which can be difficult to detect as audits that are compulsory for the organisation aren't compulsory for boards. So as I said, these issues aren't dissimilar from issues that arise in a broader organisational context, but they really are quite serious because of the impact they have in terms of setting the tone for the organisation.
David?
Yep, sorry, Chris.
Yeah, David, is there anything that you would like to see in board meeting papers, information that you think the board should see on a regular basis to help them understand the risk of corruption and fraud within their organisation?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So often you see board papers consumed by operational information, and depending on what the charter of the board is, but ultimately, you know, my view of boards is that strategic and governance role. So that governance component is particularly important. So what you'd be looking for is a real focus on the risk issues for the organisation, including corruption risks, and how what processes are being put in place to mitigate those risks, and getting regular updates as a board member about any findings or issues that have arisen. And you'd be looking for learnings from like agencies and sectors as well. So if there is an issue occurring in another entity that is similar, or any of the reports that are issued by the integrity agencies, Ombudsman, IBAC, Fargo, would be matters of real importance to board members, I would have thought.
David, do you find that organisations generally document their corruption risks well?
Very broad variation, I must say. There's those that focus on particular elements of the business and perhaps don't have a broader view of corruption risk. There's those that have quite a good view and suite of risks that are viewed and addressed. I think it's a case of, because the public sector is so broad, we see a massive variation. So there are some best practices we see, and it goes back to my point about the attestation. I really struggle with that word all the time. It's not necessarily the most, the highest number of risks that are identified and mitigated. It is the most targeted areas, and I think that's important.
David, would you also have advice for boards in this space with the resources they have around governance, anti-corruption? How much do you think, or do you have a view of what proportion should be proactive, what proportion should be reactive? So reactive, not necessarily being a pejorative, you know, you've got financial controls that automatically flag variations, you've got, so what's kind of the proportion, do you think, of resources that should be proactive and say, you know, doing internal reviews of particular controls, regularly, I don't know, conducting queries or investigations across the organisation? Like, what's the proactive, reactive split there?
Yep, always attention in this space. The reactive function is critically important to address issues as they arise and report on them, and again expose the vulnerabilities across the organisation that allowed the behaviours to occur. The proactive function is incredibly important, but often the hardest one to get traction with, because it's the looking to at things that haven't occurred. But if your preventative regime is sound enough, then it absolutely minimises the need for the reactive function. So I'm not sure there is a percentage you can actually put on it, but what I would encourage, particularly the governance areas and senior leaders, to think about the proportion of spend or the proportion of resources, and make sure that the proactive function is carried out, and that the benefits are then demonstrated to the board through the reporting regimes that are available.
That's great. That's really helpful, David. I'll let you.
Yep. Okay. I've just got a couple more points I want to make. I'll just close out with the boards that just closing out, the prevention and detection strategies for issues related to board members are not dissimilar to the organisational approach. But our research paper that we did, that I mentioned, included recommendations around putting greater focus on the selection, the probity checks and specific training to support board appointments. So really strengthening up the front end and the education for board members around the role and the expectations in that role. And again, that report I talked about is on our website. So I've covered a fair bit of ground in what I've highlighted. I think there's a few key takeaways there around what senior leaders ought to be focusing on in terms of behaviours in the organisation and what they can do to make sure your organisation is best set up to mitigate those particular behaviours. What I want to do in closing is I want to reiterate the importance of the work we do as a public sector and public sector employees, and how it is so important that we operate ethically and honestly. Our communities expect and rely on this approach, and they enjoy having confidence in their public sector, and that's what we've got to protect when we go about our role. And ultimately, our actions as leaders in setting the standard is critical. And as I said, I hope some of the material I've covered today will reaffirm what you do or help guide you in what to do. Thanks for your time.
David, just a question returning back to the board about minutes.
Yes.
I think you mentioned minutes in passing. I don't know if you wanted to unpack that a little bit. And what would you be, when IBAC is investigating an organisation, reviewing an organisation, what are the kinds of things that you expect to see in the minutes? Yeah,
okay. So clearly there's schools of thought around minutes and what should find their way into the minutes. Obviously, decision making must be a part of the board minutes. Anywhere there is an actual decision that affects the direction of the organisation. Often it is useful to also put in the documentation, supporting documentation or appendix that might go and sit behind those decisions. The general discussion is probably not necessary. We note there is variations, we see general discussion. But the most important thing that we look for if in the minutes and where decisions are being made is where and if conflicts of interest have been raised and whether they've been appropriately discussed and managed. And we know that conflict of interest arise in many, many different ways, shapes and forms. And it is prevalent in regional areas. They often, they're very prevalent by virtue of the fact that board members have relationships and interests in broader community. So by having a conflict of interest doesn't necessarily mean that people are excluded from decision making. It's important that they are identified, and it's noted in the minutes that it's identified, and the management of that conflict of interest is discussed as well and noted in the minutes. And as I said, it doesn't necessarily exclude someone from it, but as long as it's been addressed and determined, the course of action has been determined and noted, then that'd be something that we'd be comfortable with.
And David, one thing we do at Golden Murray Water that I think a lot of other water corporations do as well is that because our directors' conflicts are disclosed on this register, which sits outside the board meetings, certainly at Golden Murray Water, and I think probably at most of the water corporations, in our meeting papers, we also have a list of standing declarations. So it's not everything that's on the register, but it's those things that are deemed to be most likely to result in a conflict of interest, so that there's just this ongoing transparency and visibility for the board as a collective around individual directors and what their conflicts might be. Not least of which is that if a director should forget about an apparent or a perceived conflict of interest, that one of their colleagues is going to remind them because they're familiar with the list of standing declarations that's there at the front of each meeting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So harking back to my oversight of council days, conflicts of interest were quite a prevalent issue in that space. Around a council meeting table, there was great variation in the understanding of conflicts of interest and how to manage them, and also great variation and reluctance of other council members to call out where a conflict of interest existed in another councillor who was then involved in the decision making. So I think it's important that it's upfront, it's as transparent as possible. And as I said, it doesn't necessarily impact on a person's involvement in the matter, but as long as it is transparent in the decision-making process, then that as a community member is, that is what I would expect and want to see.
David, now brace yourself, because I'm going to ask you to make a series of generalisations, so just brace yourself for that. The first generalisation is, do you have a sense, either yourself individually or IBAC collectively, as to whether corruption in the state public service is getting less over time, more over time? Can't say, don't know.
Yeah, really difficult to make a definitive call. What I think is that we're seeing more reports and notifications of improper or corrupt conduct. Does that necessarily mean there is more? I don't think so. I just think more is coming to the surface and more is being reported through to our office, which is a good thing. It's clearly a good thing. But as I say, I don't think that it's an emerging issue any more than what it was a number of years ago. It is more the case of it's coming to the surface and to our attention. Again, it doesn't mean we ought to be complacent. I think what we spoke about in terms of continually reiterating to the organisations, to our employees, the importance of ethical decision making, making sure there is that environment where if people see something they're not comfortable with, they know that they can raise it with a supervisor or anonymously to the organisation or to one of the integrity agencies, that their confidentiality will be maintained and the matter will be addressed. I think that's really important as well. And I think it's important also that where our issues do come to the surface and are dealt with, instead of just dealing with the issue and moving on, that there is broader learnings that are provided to the organisation around the issue and championing the resolution of it as well. So seeing it as an opportunity to create a better workplace for everyone to work in. So going back to your point, I'm hard to call whether the numbers are up, down or consistent, but I certainly think there's more matters being reported to us.
Right. David, I've got another generalisation curveball to throw to you, an even bigger generalisation than the last one. So, as I said, brace yourself. Reflecting on Australian culture, do you think that there is something about Australian culture that is particularly helpful or particularly unhelpful in the context of organisational fraud and corruption? And I don't know if you have any specific observations from that as well.
So that is a really interesting question. There's a couple of elements that come to mind straight away. I think the Australian culture that we might think of previously around it's not right to dob in a mate, that may have existed, but I think over time that is diminishing. And then I often think about how Melbourne as a major city it's quite different as well. It's quite a different economy to the rest of Victoria. So Melbourne, I think, has moved on and changed quite significantly, and that's now having a ripple effect as it's moving out to the outer edges of Victoria. I did see it in my previous role that there were some outposts in some regional areas where things were being done and, at a council depot that were completely inappropriate. There was an acceptance in that area that it was okay. There was an acceptance within the community that it was okay. And it wasn't until it all unravelled that there was, maybe that wasn't right. But that's getting more of a rarity as time goes on. So I think as our society and community evolve, I think that's changing more and more and more. So I would have said, yes, there would have been a cultural impediment to people disclosing or raising issues that related to their workplace and to their workmates. But I think that's changing and changing quite quickly.
Thank you. That's really interesting to hear. We've also got a really interesting question from our engaged attendees this afternoon. And the question is, do you think that there's a difference between the public and private sector in dealing with corruption and conflicts of interest? And if there is a difference, do you think then that makes it hard to go from one to the other, perhaps particularly if you're going private to public?
Yeah, look, I do. Look, it's a lot to do with the system of the organisation. So a public sector organisation that's well set up has good systems in place. It makes it very difficult for corrupt or improper conduct to continue. But we do see, particularly in quite senior people that come across from private sector who bring some of the private sector behaviours across, are challenged by the public sector ethics and behavioural levels that we expect and require. It is a problem. We see it, and I mentioned before, I'm astounded still by the number of senior executives in the public sector that are involved in behaviours that draw our attention. And I must say, quite a number of those have private sector backgrounds.
And just a general note to our attendees, you've probably noticed that we've now moved into a general question and answer session. This is the last part of our presentation this afternoon. So just as you're doing at the moment, keep those questions flooding in. We're getting some really good ones. You've obviously struck a chord with your presentation, David, because we're getting some really good questions. A great one that I'll put to you is that about the role of diversity as a control against fraud and corruption. And do you think that it has any significance as a control against fraud and corruption?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, yes, I do. I think there's many pieces to the puzzle around building corruption-resistant organisation. And I think that's an important one and often one that's overlooked. We talked about silos where behaviours can operate that draw our attention, the corrupt or improper conduct. I think diversity in terms of your workforce is a really important way of preventing and protecting against that. So that's a really good question. There's not a lot more I can say about it, but I'm glad it was raised.
And again, David, one of our very engaged and astute attendees has noted in one of your slides there was a point about releasing a public record of meetings. This has certainly been an issue in the water sector for some years, where we do, of course, minutes of the meeting, but and we do also release a public summary of that meeting. But across different water corporations, that summary of the meeting, there can be quite a variation in the detail in that. Do you have any view as to how close the public record of your meeting should be to the minutes of the meeting, or should they just be one and the same?
Yeah, look, I've got a view they should almost be one and the same. I think transparency is such an important element of the operation of a public sector entity. I mean, it's so important that the community get to see what is being decided, what basis is being decided upon, and the outcome of it. Noting, of course, there will be a whole range of confidential issues that can't be part of public minutes, and noting the way council deal with that in terms of excluding those particular elements from their publicly published minutes. But I think for a public sector entity, the best way of operation is as ultimately transparent as possible. And I think that's a really important way of engaging with the community and maintaining that public trust.
And again, David, I think we've got the most engaged audience that has ever attended a conference. So this is wonderful. And again, probably a reflection of the quality of what you've shared with us. But let's say there is a situation where, say, for instance, in an employment process where through a thorough and through an independent process, someone has been appointed who does happen to be the relative of a senior executive, who does happen to be some other conflict of interest. How can organisations go about, I suppose, dealing not just with substance, but also perception in those situations?
Yeah, and again, it's quite common in regional areas where employment in public sector corporations and people with particular skill sets, there might be limited options either way. So I think it's important that the employment process again is quite transparent. The policy and process is followed. that any senior executive that has an interest in the person that might be ultimately interviewed and employed, that is noted. There is definite separation between the two, so that person doesn't have an involvement in the employment process, and it's communicated. I think, again, the transparency issue, we often see it arising that you hear, and we receive direct complaints around, rumours around, involvement of senior people in the organisation in getting employment for families and friends. It's based on that perception. There's no real evidence that sits behind it. And we often see that there is no basis to it. So we often then comment back to the organisation, well, how do you deal with it? How did you deal with that perception? And again, it's about the transparency in the selection process and nominating that, up front, that there is that connection between two people, but the senior person in the organisation had no involvement, and therefore the policy and process was followed.
But is there something you should be doing in the court of public opinion? So when you have run a transparent and a thorough process, obviously the transparency and the thoroughness of that process is not necessarily going to be visible to everyone in the organisation. So is there almost something that you need to do to say, look, Chris Dalton was appointed. He does happen to be the cousin of whoever, but, we want to assure the rest of the organisation that this was an arm's length kind of independent process that led to him being appointed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there is a balance between, raising it as an issue, but I think where there clearly is a perception, and it's a well-known perception, that that there is a lot of merit in being transparent and communicating that to the workforce, not necessarily externally, but certainly to your internal workforce.
So, David, I've been throwing a few generalisations at you, but now I'm going to throw a very specific question at you. And that is, have you seen anyone, and anyone being an organisation, that has done fraud and corruption risk particularly well, or from your experience?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. We often get asked that, who's the role gold example of fraud and corruption prevention, and it's a bit of a movable feast. We've seen some organisations really change the way they operate and implement a lot of great processes and systems. The bigger departments are they're well funded. They tend to have their own integrity areas and broader governance areas. They're often well resourced to implement it within their departments, but often their time is taken up with their satellite portfolio agencies. Of the organisations that I've seen and had experiences with, I look at your WorkSafes and your EPAs. EPA is challenging as well because they've got so many remote offices. But WorkSafe was particularly sound in the way they went around their internal corruption controls.
David, we're almost at an end of our Q&A time this afternoon. So if you had just one thing to say to a director or a general manager to end this session, just one thing that they should take away, something perhaps that they should do, an action, what is that one thing? Yep.
Okay, so I think this comes back to me time and time again. I think there's 4 things that are really important. The first one is that focus on your policy framework. And I went to it a number of times. The importance, and sometimes it can be quite a dry task within an organisation to update and review, adopt and implement policies and educate your workforce around the implementation and the importance of those policies. But I think the focus on that, setting the ground rules, is incredibly important. Secondly, I think to do that, you need an appropriately resourced governance area. And it's difficult when you've got a highly operational organisation. Investing funds in your governance area can be challenging. And often if you're looking to save funds, that's an area that gets looked at early on. But I think it's important that you have the appropriate focus and funding for your governance areas. Audits are the third issue, which are really important. Not paying lip service to an audit function is super important. It's not a checkbox activity. Audits ought really complement the business, enhance the business, be used as a tool to really improve operations and be seen as a more positive function as opposed to a bit more negative as they often seem. And the last point, and I've said this a number of times through today, the most important thing I think is that organisations and senior executives create an environment where if people see something wrong, they're confident and capable and know where to raise and who to raise that issue with, and it gets dealt with appropriately. I think that's the most important point I can make.
David, I can't thank you enough for your presentation this afternoon. Don't wait for the feedback results to be sent to you. I think the level of involvement we've had from our attendees this afternoon, but also you can take, I mean, I had some questions pre-prepared for this session, but about half of my questions was just engaging with the material as you were presenting because it was interesting and it prompted some questions. So can't thank you enough for your time this afternoon. I do have a few housekeeping messages for our attendees. Please do join us at the social hour at 5 o'clock. Included in the social hour will be the drawing of the Beyond Blue raffle. Please do visit the conference website to purchase tickets if you haven't done so already. You've still got 30 minutes to do that. Also included in the social hour will be a playing of the second half of the MD's video interview. So you'll get an insight into what MDs have been doing during this period of lockdown. Importantly, the social hour will also allow you to network with delegates. And this is one of the reasons why we attend functions like this, because Vic-Water will be running some breakout room chats towards the end of the hour. So prepare yourself for a drink, join the social hour session, sit back and enjoy. This now completes this stream session. I do thank you so much once again for being such a engaged and involved group of attendees. Thanks so much for attending today.